There is a very specific moment in a person's life when you no longer collapse, but you also no longer move forward. You keep living, keep working, keep trying, yet inside, a quiet emptiness has appeared. The goals that once excited you no longer create motivation. Each step feels heavy, not because it is too hard, but because it no longer feels right. And it is exactly here that the thought of quitting shows up. Not violently, not in despair, but reasonably, as if stopping is the safest choice. According to Jung, this is not a sign of failure, but a sign that a limit has been reached. When an old life structure is no longer strong enough to support who you are becoming, energy withdraws. Not to make you fall, but to force you to stop and look deeper. This exhaustion does not come from you becoming weaker, but from you having moved beyond your old framework. The problem is that many people quit right here. They mistake stagnation for being on the wrong path. They take emptiness as proof that they have failed. But Jung suggests that this darker stage often appears right before an important shift, when the inner life is restructuring from the roots. This is not meant to push you to try harder, but to help you see why the moment you most want to stop may be the moment you are moving closest to the next transition. Part 1. This exhaustion does not come randomly. Have you ever noticed periods when, even after getting enough rest, the exhaustion still does not go away? You still sleep enough, still eat relatively well, still go to work, still meet your responsibilities, still do not give up on your life. From the outside, there are no signs you are falling apart. But inside there is a feeling that is hard to name. You do not feel replenished enough to continue, even though the basic conditions have been met. What makes this state uncomfortable is that it does not resemble the tiredness you already understand. You are not so tired that you only want to sleep forever. You are also not tired because you push too hard for a short time. You maintain a steady rhythm. It is just that everything consumes more energy than before. Things that used to feel natural now require strain. Even though the difficulty has not increased, there is no clear cause. And because there is no clear cause, many people begin to doubt themselves. Maybe I am weaker. Maybe I am less focused. Maybe I am no longer disciplined. When it drags on, the reflex is to fix behavior, rest more, sleep more, reorganize time, for stricter routines. These solutions sound reasonable, and often they work. But with this kind of exhaustion, you try them, and it still does not disappear. Imagine sitting for a long time in a closed room with poor air circulation. At first you feel fine, but the longer you stay, the more heavy and sluggish you become, the harder it is to concentrate. The problem is not your posture. The problem is oxygen. Unless you open the door or change the conditions, resting inside that room will never fully solve the suffocating feeling. This exhaustion works similarly. It does not come from lacking strength, but from an internal system maintaining prolonged tension. When someone must constantly focus, self-control, maintain pace, and carry responsibility, the nervous system learns to operate in high alert. At first, high alert is effective. Sharper reactions, more endurance, better pressure handling. But it is not designed to last forever. If it continues, the body and mind reduce energy investment to protect themselves. It does not happen by collapsing you. It happens quietly, by making energy harder to access. You still have ability, but it takes more force to activate. You still work, but it no longer feels smooth. That is why ordinary rest does not solve it. Rest helps after spending energy. But here, the problem is not only what you spent, it is that the system has shifted into saving mode. Like a device that lowers power after running too long to prevent overload, your mind and body do the same. And once in that mode, forcing performance as before only makes the exhaustion more obvious. You see it in everyday life. Someone does the same job, with the same workload, the same skills, no major changes, yet concentration becomes harder. Replying to an email takes more effort. Starting a familiar task becomes slow, not because they forgot how, but because each action requires more mental push. What can mislead you is that this exhaustion does not necessarily come with intense negative emotion. You are not deeply sad, not panicked, not hopeless. You just feel everything fading. You still live, still interact, but without vividness. And because there is no dramatic crisis, it is even harder to admit something is wrong. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Not to glorify suffering, but to point out that when the mind is forced to face what has been ignored too long, the feeling is often unpleasant. This hard-to-explain exhaustion may be that kind of signal, quiet, persistent, and impossible to keep ignoring. Modern life treats fatigue as a quick behavioral problem. Rest more, optimize, discipline yourself. Those approaches work for ordinary fatigue. But with this kind of exhaustion, pushing harder often drains you faster. The more you try to do it right, the more you feel the lack, because you are using familiar tools to solve a signal that is not actually at the behavioral level. Willpower is not always the right answer. Sometimes training does not make you healthier. It makes the system tighten further. At that point, exhaustion is not weakness. It is the body and mind trying to reestablish a safe limit. If you are in this state, the first step is not accusation. Do not conclude you are undisciplined or worse than before. You may be facing a kind of exhaustion that familiar methods cannot solve, because it is not about doing too little or too much. The essential point is this: if you are exhausted in a way you cannot explain, the problem may not be that you have not rested enough or tried enough. Your body and mind may be signaling that the way they have been operating has reached its limit. Before forcing yourself to be stronger, it may be more necessary to understand what kind of exhaustion this is, so you do not drain yourself further with solutions that only look reasonable. Part 2. When the old path no longer carries you forward. Once you understand the exhaustion is not random, another truth becomes clearer. The problem is not that you have not tried hard enough, but that the form of life you have been relying on can no longer perform its original function. When energy withdraws, not only because you are burned out, but because you are no longer nourished from within, what is tested first is not willpower, but the path you built over years. Imagine running your life through a clear structure for a long time. Priorities, responsibilities, standards for success. That structure helped you mature, stabilize, and build a place in the world. But at some point, even if everything still runs on schedule, you realize it no longer creates growth. It is not wrong. It just no longer expands. You do not yet have another structure to replace it, but you cannot keep living in this one without feeling yourself gradually shrink. This is when one form of life has finished its role, while the next has not appeared. At this stage, what is happening is not a lack of motivation, but the completion of a development cycle. In developmental psychology, each life stage needs a structure to support existence and growth, a role, a value system, a definition of success, a self-story. When it fits, it gives direction and energy. When it has completed its task, it cannot nourish the next stage, even if it still looks stable. The difficulty is that the old structure does not collapse. It remains reasonable, recognized, safe, And because it still works, you assume the problem must be you. Not persistent enough, not determined enough, not trying hard enough. But if you look closely, what changes first is your inner relationship to the same life. You still do familiar things, but you no longer expand. Results that once satisfied you now only maintain you. They no longer nourish. Here, a deeper fear appears. Not fear of failure, but fear tied to identity. The old path is not just how you live, it is how you know who you are. It is tied to a long story. I am this kind of person, I go in this direction, I believe in these things. When the path no longer fits, the story wobbles. The question becomes not, what should I do next? But, if I no longer live this way, who am I? Literature describes this quietly in Dante's opening to the Divine Comedy. In midlife, he realizes the familiar path no longer guides him. The path still exists. He can still walk it, but it no longer points inward. That recognition does not destroy him, but forces him to admit one chapter is closed even though the next has not opened. Jung saw moments like this as natural transitions in psychological development. People cling to structures that once helped them survive, not because they are wrong, but because they were once right. Yet inner life develops in cycles, and each cycle has a completion point. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." A form of life can become tight, not because you are wrong, but because you have changed. So the feeling that you cannot continue is not weakness. It is a sign you have walked the road to the point where it has nothing new left to give. Forcing yourself to continue through willpower does not create progress. It increases inner conflict, because you are asking a finished structure to keep doing a job it no longer fits. The core meaning here is not that you must immediately turn somewhere else, but that you dare to admit the structure has finished its role. That admission is hard because it requires stepping out of a familiar identity story before you have a new one. But the emptiness is what opens the possibility of transformation. When you stop forcing yourself to live by reasons that have run dry, you make space for a different life axis to form. What is needed now is not rushed action, but honest recognition. What in your life are you maintaining mainly out of habit, safety, or fear of losing identity, rather than out of a feeling of being alive? Simply facing that question already shows you are no longer asleep inside the old structure. That is the meaning, not immediate change, but the awareness that a cycle has truly closed and another is preparing to begin, with more clarity and honesty. Part 3. The feeling of being stuck is a sign of a threshold of change. Once you accept the old path is finished, inner life does not instantly reveal a new route. What appears is often an in-between space. You are no longer supported by what was familiar, but nothing new is clear enough to follow. You still live, still show up, but the sense of definite direction is gone. This begins quietly. No collapse, no big event, only the awareness that something ended. Looking back, you cannot continue as before without strain. Looking ahead, you see no direction clear enough to step into. You stand between stages. What has passed is no longer a place to stay. What is coming is not yet formed. A simple example is leaving a job after many years. The old job is done. You cannot go back as before. But the new one is not here yet. The first days are not necessarily crisis. You wake up, do routines, handle responsibilities. But you do not feel today is leading anywhere. No schedule holds you. No short-term goal pulls you. You have not failed, but you have not begun again. You are in between, and that is what creates the stuck feeling. In this state, the most noticeable thing is not despair, but the absence of an orienting axis. You do not lack ability. You do not lack responsibility. But you no longer feel guided. Old decision criteria no longer work. Each choice sits in a gray zone without certainty. Psychologically, this is when the familiar orientation system pauses. Before, the mind functioned through clear markers: what to do, why, and where it leads. When these markers no longer align, the mind does not collapse into chaos, but it cannot decide the same way. This creates a distinctive feeling: you still act, but action no longer produces progress. Because the axis is gone, your inner rhythm slows, not because you choose slowness, but because there is no pull. Before, inertia carried you. Here, inertia is gone. You cannot reuse the old engine. So slowing becomes natural. Time changes too. Days pass but do not form a stream of progress. Before, milestones made time feel like movement upward. Here, milestones disappear. Time becomes flat. You do not feel yourself falling behind, but you do not feel yourself moving forward. This, standing sideways, makes stuckness last. Jung's view adds a deeper understanding. Such stages are not malfunctions, but transition points. When consciousness reaches the limit of familiar patterns, energy no longer flows in the old direction. That does not mean energy vanishes. It means it is not yet organized around a clear axis. People experience that as stuckness. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Not by rushing to find a new direction, but by staying long enough with the unknown, so what is dim inside can come into view." So this in-between is not deviation. It is a threshold. Thresholds have no signposts, no instructions, no immediate answers. They place you where the old is gone, and the new is not yet shaped. Willpower cannot make you move faster because there is no clear road to speed up on. That is why stuckness often appears not when everything collapses, but when everything continues without direction. You live, but you do not know in what sense you are going. If there is one thing to keep here, it is this: being stuck is not necessarily being blocked. It is often standing at the threshold of change. Before moving on, take a quiet moment. Slow your breathing by one beat. You do not need an answer. Recognize that if you feel stuck, you may not be trapped. You may be standing at the edge of a change being prepared from within. Part 4. Why the closer you are to the turning point, the more you want to stop. If stuckness is a doorway, then a familiar reaction shows up right at the border. You want to stop, not because you have no strength, but because a subtle pull appears inside, pulling you backward. The closer you get to the turning point, the clearer the hesitation becomes. You postpone decisions. You want more time. You feel you need more rest even though you are not tired in the usual sense. The paradox is that this often happens when you have gone far enough to sense that real change is near. Outer life may still look steady, no crisis forcing action. So stopping feels reasonable. You tell yourself you need certainty, a strong reason, more time. But if you look closer, the desire to stop does not come from confusion. It comes from clarity. You know that if you continue, something familiar will not remain the same. In Jungian terms, this is characteristic. The old structure no longer carries you. The new is not formed enough to support you. You stand between two states. This overlap creates quiet tension. Not sharp pain, but prolonged unease that makes you want to keep things unchanged a bit longer. In this zone, wanting to stop is a natural reflex to big change. In Jungian therapy, I once met a man in his 40s who came not because life was collapsing, but because everything was fine yet no longer right. Stable job, safe relationships, outward image that reassured others. As he realized his life had been built mostly on reasonable, safe, socially approved choices, he wanted to stop. Pause therapy returned to the familiar rhythm to reduce disruption. The desire appeared only after he saw clearly what needed to change. Not because he was lost, but because he understood the next step would demand living differently. That desire is not weakness. It is a human reflex to the cost of transformation. The closer you get to a turning point, the things that once made you feel safe start to look fragile. You see what you might have to leave behind. Roles, relationships structured by the old order, images of yourself that once held you together. That clarity creates a backward pull, not because the new is wrong, but because the old was shelter. Jung did not see this as a glitch, but as inevitable. Approaching fundamental change demands higher honesty. Habit is no longer enough. Old reasons are no longer enough. When that demand becomes clear, the desire to stop functions as delay, so you do not have to face irreversible change immediately. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. Not judgment, but an uncomfortable truth. The closer you get to what is essential inside you, the more subtle avoidance becomes. So the desire to stop is not a signal you should quit, and not proof you lack determination. Many people feel it only when they are close to a real turning point. The closer you are to the center of change, the greater the resistance. Not because the path is wrong, but because the price is clear. You are not just changing a choice, you are changing how you exist. The common mistake is forcing yourself forward or rushing back for safety. The Jungian spirit suggests neither. What you need is recognition. When you see that wanting to stop is part of transformation, you stop treating it as the enemy. You treat it as a signal that you are near an important boundary. This requires a difficult capacity. Staying with hesitation without letting it choose for you. Not denying the desire to stop, and not obeying it immediately. Just staying, observing, understanding what it says about where you are. Then you keep the clarity needed for the next step. The lesson is not to overcome hesitation quickly, but not to let hesitation decide quietly. When you are calm enough not to rush backward and not to force forward through coercion, you stand in the right position for real change. Before continuing, pause again. Slow the breath. Feel where you are standing in your life. Sometimes transformation begins not with a grand decision, but with an experience being looked at directly, acknowledged, and allowed to exist long enough to shift on its own. Part 5. Quitting now means turning your back on yourself. At this point, stopping can look practical. You tried enough. Not every path must be carried to the end. Turning back avoids more exhaustion. But when you have gone far enough to become conscious, when you have reached the boundary where the old no longer sustains you, and the new is not yet formed, quitting is no longer neutral. It becomes a return to safety, while moving away from the truest part trying to emerge. From a Jungian perspective, not every letting go betrays the self. Some things must end so others can begin. But Jung focused on moments when people withdraw not because the path is wrong, but because it demands more truth, more responsibility, and less protection from familiar reasons. Quitting here often arrives quietly, as a reasonable thought, maybe I should stop. That reasonableness is what makes it dangerous. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Often quoted as encouragement, but it is heavy. Becoming who you truly are is not a reward. It is risk. It requires passing through stages where support systems withdraw. No excitement, no motivation, no validation, no ready answers. In that emptiness, many people turn back not because they are incapable, but because they are not ready to live with what is forming inside. Jung believed that when the unconscious brings you close to the true axis of life, it no longer motivates you with excitement. It becomes stark, and starkness is easily mistaken for being on the wrong path. But it may be a sign you can no longer be guided by old reasons. An example often given is Ed Sheeran. Years of street performing, constant travel, sleeping on friends' sofas, repeated rejection by labels, and awareness that he did not fit the market's template. Adjusting himself to be more acceptable would have been reasonable. But if he had done that, what would be lost would not only be his style, but his connection to what felt most truthful in him. Success came later, but the turning point was that he did not withdraw from his sincerity. From a Jungian view, quitting rarely happens at the beginning. It happens when you have gone far enough that turning back becomes reasonable. And because it is reasonable, it is no longer just behavioral. It becomes existential. You choose convenience or truth. Many people do not quit because they lack ability, but because they are too close to their truth. If they continue, they cannot return to unconsciousness. They must choose differently and take responsibility for a more honest self. Facing that, stopping becomes a way to preserve familiar safety. The Bible captures this symbolically. The Israelites want to turn back right before entering the Promised Land, not because the new is bad, but because the desert, though harsh, is known. The new land is unknown. Psychologically, people often prefer familiar pain to unfamiliar life. Jung believed that each time someone retreats right before a turning point, an unconscious belief strengthens. When things become real, I stop. That belief repeats later in other forms. And the deepest cost is not failure. It is the fracture of trust in yourself. This does not demand that you keep going at all costs. It asks a subtle question. Do you want to stop in order to live more correctly, or to avoid living more truthfully? They look similar, but they are different. If you stop because a cycle truly ended, you feel lighter. If you stop because you fear stepping into yourself, you carry emptiness, regret, and a question that repeats for years. That is why quitting here is not about success or failure. It is about inner loyalty. The road may tire you. It may no longer feel exciting like it did at the beginning. But it is the road you chose with sincerity. If you stop only to return to comfort, you will not only lose a goal. You may lose the feeling that you lived in line with your own choice. The final thing to hold is this. The moment you want to quit often appears not when you are going wrong, but when you are getting close to what is most right in you. In Jung's spirit, exhaustion, stuckness, hesitation are not your fault. They can be signs that inner life demands higher honesty. You are not being tested because you are weak, but because you are standing at a real threshold. Don't quit. Here does not mean force yourself harder. It means do not turn your back on yourself at the most sensitive moment. If you stop only to return to familiar safety, you may feel lighter for a moment, but you may carry the feeling that you did not live with what was calling from within. If you are patient enough to stay, honest enough not to betray yourself, then even if the road ahead is unclear, you have already begun moving in the right direction. You do not need to see the whole road. You only need to recognize that hesitation is not random. It appears when an old version is closing, so another version can form in the quiet space. What decides is not speed, but whether you are still moving in line with what you truly believe is right. Thank you for staying until the end. If this gave you a moment of recognition, Press like and subscribe to continue exploring more deeply with us. Inner Journeys through the lens of Carl Jung. See you in the next video.